I'm Julian from Worldwide Christian Travel, and this lecture is brought to you in conjunction with GGC Jerusalem. Today, Joel Weinberg will be discussing what did Jesus eat, food in the Bible. Joel has a master's from Hebrew University, Jerusalem, and is dedicated to teaching the New Testament to Jews and Judaism to Christians. He is well trained in biblical interpretations, theology, and Middle Eastern affairs. As well as being a respected tour guide, Joel was a guest lecturer on the topic of Judaism at several renowned universities, including Lund University in Sweden, Harvard in the USA, and the University of Oxford in the UK. So Joel, over to you.
Okay, well, welcome back everybody, or welcome to those who've tuned in for the first time. We're going to be having a lecture that will have two parts to it. The first part, we're going to talk about actual biblical foods. We're going to cover what existed in the Bible, what people ate, and then slightly tune that down to what Jews ate, and then try to re-understand Mark chapter 7, because that's a very important chapter dealing with food and traditions and theology within the Jesus's world. And I think we'll be able to understand what was said there in a very different way than traditionally interpreted. So, Robert Karras, who is a renowned Franciscan theologian, had a wonderful line. And if you follow the New Testament, it actually is Jesus is either going to a meal, at a meal, or coming from a meal. We'll be dealing with some of those meals in today's talk. Let's start with food at the very beginning. Of course, in the very beginning of the book of Genesis, we read in the story of the Garden of Eden, we're told, and the Lord God commanded the man, saying, every tree of the garden thou mayst freely eat, but the tree of knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat from it, for the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. So the first man, of course, was a vegetarian, and that's what he lived off of. And here we have the story of the angels visiting Abraham. And here we can see the food of somebody in a desert, but a special meal, not just an everyday meal. And we're told of Abraham, and he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself towards the ground. And Abraham hastened into the tent unto Sarah and said, make quickly 3 measures of fine meal again, the best ground wheat, knead it and make cakes. In other words, not just any regular bread. And Abraham ran unto the herd and fetched it a calf tender and good, and gave it unto a young man, and he hastened to dress it. And he took butter and milk. Now, the rabbis had a major issue with that, because as many of you know, in Judaism, you're not allowed to mix meat and milk. But of course, this was before the Torah, before the commandments were given. Even so, some people had an issue, how could the founder of the Jewish people be mixing meat and milk? But here is a gourmet meal, really a major meal. Jacob, food follows Jacob all the time. We have the story of Esau coming back from the field, and Jacob sought pottage. Now, we have to keep in the idea, the typical food in those days was actually pottage, cooked lentils, cooked wheat, together with bread, which was exactly the meal that Jacob made. And Esau came from the field, and he was faint, and Esau said to Jacob, feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage. In other words, they were lentils. And we're told later, he gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink. So he drank with it. Again, traditionally, water, but also wine was very prominent. We'll be talking about wine a little bit later. Now, a little bit later with Esau once again, his father wants to give the blessing to Esau. Jacob and Rebekah have a different idea, and here is a major meal, and we have, and I will make the savory meat for thy father. So you have meat, and you have bread, and you have wine. So there you have a typical high quality meal of meat, bread, and wine. And then we can get some idea of what are the special things that they have when Jacob's sons return to Egypt to meet with Joseph. They bring down a little balm, they're the best fruits, a little balm, a little honey, spices, myrrh, nuts, and almonds. We have that there were nuts, there were spices. We'll be talking about honey very soon because it's not really honey. The translation is questionable because some of the things that were brought back might have been even slightly different, but the translation is not clear. In the book of Ezekiel, we have a wonderful recipe. Now, this is a recipe that Ezekiel makes that he will be living off of for 390 days. Take thou also unto thee wheat and barley, beans and lentils, and millets and fitches, and put them in one vessel, and make thee bread thereof. So here we have, and thy meat which thou shalt eat be by weight, and thou shalt drink water by measure, a sixth of a hin is a quantity, for the time you drinks. And thou shalt eat it as barley cakes. Now, Ezekiel bread is seen by some elements in the evangelical world today as the recipe for the biblical bread. We can even see an example of that right over here, Ezekiel 4:9 bread. Now, the problem is that what Ezekiel described here is clearly the term bread might be used. We'll see later why that's not really what it meant. This was once again a pottage. It was not a bread, but the mistranslation of bread, it was a pottage that would be cooked up and eaten. And then we can see that he says you will cook it on human dung. This is the typical way in the desert, is cooking on, you bake breads or you make fires out of camel dung, which is very dry. Until today it is used. Those of you who've been to Sinai might have actually seen it. It's the very typical way because that is the best burning element you can find in a desert where there are no trees. Here we have bread. Now this is the challah, the traditional Sabbath bread. And here's the blessing. Many, many times in the Bible, and Jesus blesses before he eats. The traditional blessing that dates back to before Jesus' time are, blessed are thou, Adonai, God's name, our God, sovereign of all, and some will translate it, king of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. And here we have the Hebrew blessing. The only problem is there's a problem with that blessing, and that is extremely important to understand because, of course, God does not bring bread from the earth. God brings wheat from the earth. So what is the element? Because bread, which is the basic element of human sustenance, is a joint mission between God, who gives the wheat, and man, who turns it into bread. So the bread of all things, which is the basis, and in every single meal you'll come across bread, and that's represented at least half of the daily caloric intake, is a joint mission between God and man. And so the blessing is said. In Hebrew, every word breaks down into a 3-letter base or root. The lamed, chet, mem is the root for lechem, or bread. We'll see additional meanings for that very soon, which gives additional meaning to how important bread was. So here you have the basic root of bread. You can get the idea of the traditional bread in those days. Now, but the use of the word bread in the Bible does not always mean bread. Because we read in Genesis, Adam is told, by the sweat of your brow, you will eat food. That's the New International Translation. If we look at King George's translation, it's in the sweat of thy face shall thou eat bread. Now, in Hebrew, the actual term is bizat apecha tochal lachem. There's a mistake here in the dotting, but that's a different problem. That is, it's bizat apecha tochal lachem. You should eat bread, but it means food. So once again, we have a problem that in the Hebrew, you can get the two elements. bread is a general word for all of your foods. But when you translate it, how do you translate? If you say food, it doesn't mean bread. If you say bread, it might not mean food. In Hebrew, you have the two elements because lechem in Hebrew can mean both, as it does in Genesis. General food, but the term for bread is used for it. It also can be used, as we see in the book of Psalms, he giveth to the beast his food. The Hebrew is noten la behema lachman. It's interesting because behema is usually considered, usually be translated as a cow, not as a beast, but it's lachma, it's bread, translated food. In other words, it can even mean animal feed. I'm going to detour for 1 second because there's a very important message that we can get from this. Now, lechem, the Hebrew word for bread, we can see the spelling, is also the same root for bread is milchama, has the same root as bread. Milchama in Hebrew means war, because you would go to fight. Your survival depended on bread, and for that reason, they have the same root. Lechem milchama, because that's what you will go to fight for, because that is the basis of your sustenance. Interestingly enough, in Arabic, lahme, which means meat. Why? Because Islam and Arabic were a desert-based society where wheat was much less found, meat was the prominent element. So once again, the basic sustenance, the root lechem, but in Arabic is for meat. Now, here we have an interesting book from one of the prophets we don't usually deal with. Tzfanya in Hebrew, Zepania in English. And here we have, I will bring distress upon men, that they shall walk like blind men because they have sinned against the Lord. And their blood shall be poured out as dust, and their flesh as the dung. But once again, for flesh or for meat, here, as can be the case in Aramaic, and is for sure the case in Arabic, it's used for flesh. Now, where do we have that play on bread and flesh? Of course, we have it at the Last Supper, but how does that fit in? At the Passover Seder, the Passover celebration, that according to the book of the three synoptic Gospels, that's what Jesus was celebrating in the Last Supper. According to John, it was the preparation for that supper. There's a tradition that all Jews do till today. And that there's which we can see in the background, 15th century, if I'm not mistaken, Haggadah, a book for Passover. And you lift up the bread and you say, Ha lachma anya. In Aramaic, this is lachma, the bread, lechem, lachma, anya, of affliction. Now, my guess is Jesus was seated with his disciples. Everybody knew the Passover tradition and of remembering the bread of affliction from Egypt. Jesus lifted it up, but he changed one letter. He said, Ha, this is lachma, and instead of anya, anna. Now, that means ha, this is lachma, as we understand, can be flesh or bread. Anna is, it is my flesh. This is my flesh. His disciples, who knew what Jesus should have been saying, said, wait a minute, what is our master trying to tell us? So here we have a tradition that is, if you go to any Jewish home on Passover, of course, the halachma is one of the key points of the Seder. We can see how Jesus' disciples were seated, and Jesus makes a play on words, which he did many times, to cause them to actually ask. And here is translated terribly, take, eat, this is my body, but this is ha lachma ana. This is my body. Now, in Hebrew, there are two words for, besides lechem, which is bread, there are two elements which are very interesting that are used for a general food. Ochel and mazon. Mazon is food you eat not to enjoy, but to get your daily sustenance. Ochel is something you can enjoy. So there are two types of food. There's the food you need to eat, but then, of course, there's also the food you want to eat. Here we can see a picture of the Passover Seder, lifting up the Passover plate with the matzah on it, saying, Ha lachma anya, this is the bread of affliction. And this is most likely a family who originated from what are called Sephardic Jews, or Jews who came from the Arab countries. They walk around and put it over everybody's head as part of the tradition. Other foods that were eaten in those days. So of course, they're legumes and grains. They're lentils, fava beans, peas, black-eyed peas, and then you have your grains, wheat, barley, and oats. So of course, the red lentils. Again, fava beans immediately would be connected, at least for my case, with Silence of the Lambs, the fava and the good Chianti, but this is more what they would look like. Peas, black-eyed peas, beautiful picture of wheat. Barley looks similar but is different. And oats, anybody who comes to Israel in these days, Israel is covered with wild wheat and wild oats. Protein, besides the oats, the legumes, that also have meat. And we're told, we're commanded, eat not of it raw, nor sodden it all with water, but roasted with fire, the way you. Then the story of the Paschal Lamb, once again, the element of meat that should be roasted, you should not eat it raw. And then Isaiah, behold joy and gladness, because the term happiness, interestingly enough, appears many times connected to meat. It says kiha. So, and there's an argument, are you obliged to eat meat on a holiday as a sign of happiness? And slaying oxen, killing sheep, it's not that happy for them. Eating flesh and drinking wine, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we shall die. Now, there was, interestingly enough, John the Baptist had an additional source of protein, and that was that he ate locusts. Now, locusts, even though it's not a meat, we'll see later, is actually a permissible source of food. Locusts are considered kosher, and Jews from Yemen and some Jews from North Africa traditionally would have eaten them. So then we have the 7 fruits of the land. In Deuteronomy, we were told the land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey. Now, 6 of these actually grow. Honey does not. But you can see here we have the 7 fruits of the land. We have dates, because almost anywhere in the Bible you will read honey, the land of milk and honey. It is a land of milk and dates. Bees had not been domesticated in those days yet, so honey was almost always derived in something which is known in Arabic and in Hebrew as silan. It is date honey. They could also make honey out of grapes, but the traditional honey that's mentioned in the Bible are dates. Now, when do we know if they're talking about actual honey in the Bible? That is when we have a verse like from the book of Psalms, he should have fed them also with the finest of wheat and with honey out of the rock. In other words, beehives in caves are connected to rocks was wild honey, and that was actual honey. All other places in the Bible, you read honey, we're actually talking about dates. Other fruits, carobs. Carobs were brought to the region around the 3rd century BC. The wild honey that John the Baptist is said to have eaten might very well have been carobs. That's why you have the John tree. Small little interesting anecdote about carobs. You can see the carob seeds. Every carob seed everywhere in the world is the exact identical weight. Amazing phenomena. And that would be used for weighing things throughout the world. That's where the carat of gold comes from. The weight of gold or of diamonds comes from 1 carob seed equals 1 carat, because that was the universal weight that could be used. Other fruits in those days, or other vegetables of the land, here we have beets and beet leaves, lettuce, radishes. These are similar to cucumbers. They're a local type of cucumber which existed. Cucumbers like you have in England exist now, but did not exist in those areas in those days. Wild eggplants, cabbages. And here we have the children of Israel reminiscing over how great they had it. We remember the fish another source, but again, fish mainly only people who live near the water. The Jews in the early years could not control the coastal area, but they did have the Sea of Galilee, which we did eat in Egypt. The cucumbers, the melons, what exactly melons were, the leeks, the onions, and the garlics. So those were the foods that they would have eaten. And later on, pears, peaches, and plums were brought by the Greeks into the areas from the time of Jesus. There already were peaches, plums, there were also apples. And here we have an interesting drawing from a tomb with some of the elements that the children of Israel remembered that they had in Egypt. So there is an overlapping between what the Jews talked about when they were crying to Moses in Egypt and actually what did exist in Egypt in those days. Now you have to flavor your food. So there's wild dill all over Israel, wild mint, there is coriander or cilantro, there is hyssop. Now, hyssop is what is called za'atar. Anybody who's been to Israel has come across it. It's put on bread, it's put in salads, it's delicious, and it's very important in the Bible. It appears many times, both connected to ceremonies. Now, we read that when Mary Magdalena, when the Sabbath was over, we're not going to get into when exactly Mary went to the tomb, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome, the three women, brought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. And also you'd bring spices. Now, so to anoint it, cover it with oil. So what would you use? The traditional branch that was used for all those things was the hyssop. We read when after this, Jesus, knowing that all things had already been accomplished, he is on the cross to fulfill the Spirit, said, I am thirsty. A jar full of sour wine was standing there. So they put a sponge full of sour wine onto a branch of hyssop. Hyssop was also used in the Bible. You shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood, and it would be thrown on both on the curtain and on the altar and then also used to put on the doorpost when the children of Israel were in Egypt. So hyssop was something that was used both for countering stench, both for food, and then also both for ceremonial elements. And most likely that was one of the spices that Mary Magdalena had brought. Last spice that we're talking about is, of course, we're not going to discuss it today. This is wild mushroom seed growing. This is the Orthodox Church of Capernaum. Here you can see the smallest of seeds grows way beyond 2 meters. So the parable, anybody who comes at this time of the year to Israel can actually see the story of the mustard seed come alive. What would people drink? They would drink wine. Now, wine was drunk all the time, just like olives were used almost solely. We don't know about actually eating olives, but using it for olive oil. Wine would all ceremonies, of course, but also in meals. But the difference was wine in those days had to be diluted 4 to 5 times, unless you really, really wanted to forget what was happening and you drink it only once or dilute it 1 or 2 times. That's also the connection of the miracle and the wine and the water, because water would dilute the wine, but it wouldn't actually be made it. So wine was drinking. Beer was there. We have Egypt had a large beer production. We can see wine into water. In reality, water into wine. I'm sorry, you would actually always add water into wine, except in this case it was pure. It was 100% water and not 80% water. Here you can see wine jugs. These were brought from Rhodes to Israel. King Herod had an obsession with high quality wine. These are amphoras that were filled with, many of these were found on Masada. So these are amphoras filled with, again, and it was as thick as a syrup. It was almost like a cough syrup. These were King Herod would use these. Here we have a stamp of King Hezekiah. This was found in Hebron, one of the 3 main storage centers for King Hezekiah's goods. This was for his wine jugs. And again, in Isaiah, no longer do they drink wine with a song. The beer is bitter to the drinkers. And here we actually see this is a beer jug a Philistine beer jug from Ashkelon that was discovered, one of the 5 Philistine cities. This was used, and actually some remnants of beer was found in it. In the summer, you have much less. That is, you've already picked your crops. The wheat has already been harvested. At Pentecost, by Pentecost, in other words, 50 days after Passover, you need to preserve food for the whole year. So you can dry it, you can salt it, you can pickle it, or you can smoke it. We know all 4 of those elements were done. This actually comes from China, but the similar things. The rooftops are not orange rooftops. In this case, these are persimmons, but traditionally in the Middle East, all rooftops were flat. 1 to sleep on in the summers, you get better ventilation, 2 to collect rain, and 3 to dry vegetables. So flat houses always had drying vegetables on them. Here we have an amazing plant also in Ashkelon to make fish paste. Once again, concentrating it, found not long ago, a Roman plant to make fish paste, the drying of fish, the ways. So that was now. What would a meal be? If you would go back 2,000 or 3,000 years, what would your meal consist of? We mentioned it a bit. So here we have, I will give you the rain of your land in his due season, the first rain and the later rain. Keep in mind, in Israel, we're dependent on the rain. Unlike in England, where it's not raining, it's a miracle. In Israel, it rains only in the winter, more or less from October through April. The summers are totally dry, almost totally dry, so we're dependent on winter rain. And thou mayest gather thy corn. Don't ask me why. The King James translation is corn. Of course, it's wheat, which is an unforgivable translation, unless corn, they're using it as a generic term for wheat, and thy wine and thy oil. So those are the 3 basic elements in every meal. Bread made out of wheat, wine, and olive oil. And the best of the oil and the best of the wine and of the grain, the choice produce, that's what you bring to the Lord. You bring to the Lord what you consume yourself. Jeremiah tells us, therefore they shall come and sing in the height of Zion and shall flow together to the goodness of the Lord for wheat and for wine and for oil and for young flock and of the herd. So here we have a little more. You take the basic meal, and then another option in 2 Chronicles. And as soon as the commandment came abroad, the children of Israel brought in an abundance of first fruits, once again, terrible translation, of corn, wine, and oil, and honey. Again, honey, date honey. A rich man's meal, we see Abigail wants to bribe King David. So what does she take? 200 loaves, 2 bottles of wine, 5 sheep ready dressed, and 5 members, again, of parched corn, it is not corn, and 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs. So here is a real meal of abundance. And once again, in Isaiah, on this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich foods for all people, a banquet of aged wines and the best meats and the finest wines. A meat rarely eaten, but symbolizes a feast. Now we have an interesting thing in the Mishnah. Again, keep in mind, Mishnah, 3rd century, late 2nd, early 3rd, but quoting earlier times. This is again written a short time after Jesus. If a man provides his wife through an agent, in other words, he's away, this is what he must give her. He must give her every week no less than 2 calves, again, quantity of wheat, and 4 calves of barley. Rabbi Yossi said only Rabbi Ishmael, who lived near Edom, Jordan of today, granted her a supply of barley. Because again, the question is, what actually existed? He must also give her half a kav of pulse and half a log of oil, and the kav of dried figs, or a manna of pressed figs. So here we have the basic things, the dry fruits, a slightly later addition, but part of the very basic foods. and how these are three basic foods. Here you see an actual picture of the picking of the wheat. Remember the story of Boaz and Ruth. Here you have the threshing floor. Here you have, this is drawn by a donkey that breaks up and releases the kernels. You pour the kernels into here, turn this around, and you grind it into flour, and then you can take it into a finer flour. The actual making of wine, the original wine basin, you stamp on the wines here, and they flow in, and they're collected from here. Interestingly enough, if you're wondering what would cause the wine to ferment, it is actually the fungus on the feet. That was the original cause of the fermentation of the wine. Then you have the oil press. Now this grinds the oil. This does not, the olives, this does not make the actual, this breaks and crushes the olives. They're then loaded into these bags, which traditionally would have been made from date trees, from palm trees, and they would make like straw baskets, and then this huge log would press them over here. First press, that's the first press, the finest, the extra virgin olive oil. When do you eat? We're told of a mealtime, and Boaz said unto her, again, story of Ruth, at mealtime come thou hither, and eat of the bread, and dip thy morsel in the vinegar. So, again, two important things we learned from here. Mealtime, this is in the morning. Mid-morning, probably 9 o'clock, first meal. Second meal, we have the story of Jacob. He comes from the field in the evening, the time of the second meal. We actually have documentation that was the case in the Dead Sea. Josephus tells us, before the sun rises, they utter nothing, and then we go, but and then after they have worked strenuously until the 5th hour, so from 5 a.m. till more or less 10 a.m., after they have seated themselves in silence, the baker serves loaves in order. And then we continue reading. They have the whole ceremony. They dine in a similar way in the evening when they have returned from work. There were 2 meals a day, a meal in the morning and then a meal in the evening. Now with Ruth, we see they dipped thy morsel. Now, anybody who's been to Israel, of course, the dipping of hummus. The traditional way of eating in those days was you would have all kinds of dips in front of you. You would take your bread and dip it. If it was a simple meal, you dip it in the lentils. You dip it in the crushed fava beans. Hummus, we know that there were garbanzo beans or chickpeas, but they weren't made into a paste as they are today. They were, same thing with wheat, they were used as a snack. You would roast wheat, or you'd roast barley, you would roast chickpeas, or you'd roast peas, and those would be used to snack on. But the typical way of eating in those days was taking the bread and dipping it. This is the dining room from Qumran. Since we have to do a little bit of touring, this is the main dining room that existed in Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, where the Essenes were based. They were a huge dining room. They would sit silently. These are some of the vessels. There was a room with over 1,000 plates. That's why one of the theories is they actually had a factory there. They did find 2 of the kilns. And this is an amazing table that was found there, even though they think this table was used actually for copying books. And those are some of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found, were written on this table most likely. Okay, so we've gone a quick scan of food in the Bible. Now we're going to just jump in. It looks like it has nothing to do with anything, but this will lead us in to the discussion in Mark 7 and what Jews can and cannot eat. And here's a commandment of hierarchy and who you have to listen to. And from Deuteronomy 17 it says, and if a matter arises which is too hard for you to judge, between degrees of guilt and bloodshed, between one judgment or another, or between one punishment or another, matters of controversy within your gates, then you shall arise and go to the place which Lord your God chooses. This, of course, is a Deuteronomical approach of going to Jerusalem, but you need to approach leadership. And you shall come to the priests, the Levites, they were known as the knowledgeable, and to the judge. So you have 3 different options to go to and inquire of them, because they in a way have a say. Now, a judge And there's somebody who was certified as a rabbi also served as a judge. There are different levels of what they could do. You shall do according to the sentence which they pronounce upon you in the place the Lord chooses, according to the sentence of the law in which they instruct you. So here is the people that make the decision, but you can have, of course, disagreements between them. Now let's jump on to Mark chapter 7. And we read, now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, and remember, come from Jerusalem, very important, gathered around him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. And here we have the text that, as Mark feels the need to explain it to us, for the Pharisees and all the Jews. Now, very problematic statement, because we know that Jesus and his disciples, who were Jews, were eating without washing their hands. So this is a problematic statement, because they were also, do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands. So who exactly is the Jews they're relating to, we'll understand soon. Thus, observing the tradition of the elders. We'll find out what this means, the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. It probably should mean they wash before it. And there are also many other traditions they observed, the washing of cups, of pots, and of bronze kettles. That's the traditional dipping it in a purification pool, known as a mikveh, to purify it before you use it. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked them, why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? He said to them, Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandments of God and hold to human tradition. Now, this is not an exact quotation of Isaiah. Isaiah, most likely the verse that Jesus was quoting in 29, says the same thing in slightly different words. So do we have a problem with the translation? Do we have a problem with the quotation? We will probably never know. Wherefore the Lord said, for as much as the people draw me with their mouth, remember that, and with their lips do they honor me, but have removed their heart far from me, just as Jesus said, and their fear towards me is taught by precept of men. So here we have an argument between the Pharisees and some of the scribes and Jesus and his followers over the element of washing before you eat, which is considered a tradition of the fathers. Now, the story keeps on going. Then he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition. In other words, tradition of your fathers. For Moses said, honor your father and mother. So Jesus is playing a game on words here, traditions of the fathers, but he's saying, honor your father and mother, and whoever speaks evil of father or mother must surely die. But you say that if anyone tells father or mother, whatever support you have had for me is a korban. A korban is an offering, and that's it. You've supported me, I owe you nothing from now on. Then you no longer permit doing anything for a father or mother. So Jesus is talking about a legalistic play somebody could theoretically make. I have reservations, but the message is getting across clearly. You have traditions, you use the traditions to interpret the law and get away from the core element of respecting your parents. That's making void the word of God through your tradition that you have handed on. So you have this tradition handed down from generation to generation, but it's not God's tradition according to Jesus. And you do many things like this. Then he called the crowd again and said to them, listen to me, all of you, and understand there is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile. There's nothing, you cannot put something into you that will defile you. But the things that come out are what defile. Now, he made this declaration, but it wasn't exactly clear. When he left the crowd enter the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. He said to them, "Then do you also fail to understand? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart but the stomach and goes into the sewer? What comes in comes out." And this, we have it in many texts in parentheses. We'll understand there's no doubt that Jesus actually said this. Thus, he declared all foods clean. But that is shocking. And throughout the ages, most biblical interpreters said that means Jesus said you can eat anything you want. All foods are clean. And why? It's not what goes into you that makes you impure. It's what comes out of you that makes you impure. And he said, it is what comes out of a person that defiles. Now he's giving the meaning behind his earlier statement. For it is from within the human heart that evil intentions come out. Fornication, theft and murder, adultery, etc., etc. All these evil things come from within and they defile. So Jesus gave his general statement, and then he's explaining what we should learn from his statement. So let's understand what the fulfillment of the law, because Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, think not that I come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. But that directly contradicts what Jesus just did, because the law specifically clearly says what animals you can eat, and we'll see that in a minute. For verily, and again, remember, verily, Jesus would have said, Amen, I say to you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled. Now here's a classical example of a mistranslation of a mistranslation. Because Jesus was talking to a group of Jewish people who most of them knew how to read. And we'll understand this in 1 minute. Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments, the smallest of commandments, we're not talking about the laws of kashrut, the laws of what is kosher, which Jesus just permitted, and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. But that's just what Jesus did, it seems. For I say unto you, that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, those he was just arguing with, ye shall in no case. So you have to be more righteous, as we talked about in the previous lecture. You have to build fences around the laws, not break down the fences and permit everything to be eaten. Now, the NIV translates what we just read a little bit different. And he says, do not think I have come to get rid of the written law or of the prophets. I have not come to do so. Instead, I have come to fulfill what is written. What I'm about to tell you is true. Heaven and earth will disappear before the smallest letter disappears from the law. So now we're getting closer to the original text. Then it says, not even the smallest mark of a pen will disappear. Now, the Berean literal Bible quotes what was said, or what was written in the Greek. Not even one iota, nor one stroke of a letter. Now, the problem was, that's not what Jesus said either, because Jesus didn't preach to his disciples in Greek. He was speaking to them in Aramaic or in Hebrew, same alphabet. So here we have the iota, the smallest of the letters in Greek. But Jesus, of course, was talking about the yud, the smallest letter in Hebrew. And there's an actual term used till today in Hebrew, which is called kutzo shel yud, like a thorn, the little extra line of the yud. So Jesus is saying, I haven't even come to change this little line here, which wouldn't change anything. I haven't come to change anything. But then how could Jesus have permitted anything to be eaten? So let's understand what is kosher. We are told, and the Lord spake unto Moses and to Aaron, saying unto them, speak unto the children of Israel, saying, these are the beasts which ye shall eat amongst the beasts that are on the earth. Whatever parteth the hoof, and is cloven-footed, and cheweth the cud. Those are the three basic elements. Amongst the beasts, that shall ye eat. And the swine, though it has a divided hoof, and a cloven-footed, yet he cheweth not the cud, is unclean to you. Now, remember, this is very important to keep in mind, the term unclean, because this is part of the whole misunderstanding of the text that we read before. We'll understand it in a minute. Of their flesh shall ye not eat, and then their carcass shall ye not touch. They are unclean to you. So the touching of the carcass and the eating of the animals, the same term, unclean, is used in the translation. These shall ye eat that are in the waters, whatever hath fins and scales in the waters, in the seas and in the rivers, them shall ye eat. So these are the fish that you're allowed to eat. They have to have fins and scales. So those are the cows which are permissible. And these are they which ye shall have an abomination amongst the fowls. And interestingly enough, in the fowls, they start with what are forbidden. But all fowls that creep, going upon all fours, shall be an abomination unto you. Yet these may ye eat of everything flying, creeping thing that goeth upon all fours, which has legs above their feet, and leap with all upon the earth. Even these of them which ye shall eat, the locust. Remember, that's what John the Baptist was living off. So you're allowed to eat things like pigeons and chickens, etc. And for these ye shall be unclean. In other words, you'll be impure. So the problem is the term unclean is used both for animals and for purity, and they mix up, and we lose out on understanding almost everything on messages all too frequently. So you can be unclean or impure, or an unclean or forbidden animal, two totally different things. So pigs and lobsters, meat and milk, which is a later understanding, though we know in Jesus' time that was done, because in 3 times in the Bible it says you should not cook a kid in its mother's milk. That's been interpreted not to mix meat and milk, and the classical cheeseburger. Okay, so now we know the difference between a chicken, because the chicken is on a no-fry list. Sorry. Okay, just had to bring that in there. Clean and unclean, pure and impure. In Hebrew, mutar asur, permissible and forbidden. A clean animal is permissible. An unclean animal, which again is the very problematic element, is, and then tameh v'tahor, you are pure or you are impure. Unclean, no, you're pure or impure. The impurity is not a physical thing. That's why when I take people down to the Qasr al-Yahud, the Dead Sea, the location on the Jordan River, where in that general vicinity, the original spot, bordering with Jordan, just north of the Dead Sea, you have that place. The water is filthy. People are baptized in it. They are spiritually clean. They are physically filthy. The purity of tameh and tahor, if you touch a dead animal, you are impure. The animal, a pig, is asur, it's forbidden, it's unclean. But you are, and there's a huge difference, and that is not translated, which, as we will see, leads to many misunderstandings. In Matthew 23, Jesus turns to the Pharisees. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! Why? You travel over land and sea to win a single convert. Now, the truth matter is, when they're talking about converts, they're talking about converting not into Judaism, but to moving from being a Sadducee, most likely. And when you succeed, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. In other words, what you're converting them into is wrong. Now let's get back to the element of hand washing, because we just read in the beginning of Mark 7, for the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands oft, eat not holding the tradition of the elders. In other words, Jews will wash their hands before they eat. And when they come from the market, and this is a better translation, except they wash, they eat not. Anything they bring from the market, they wash. In other words, they wash themselves, not so much the vegetables, but also possibly the vegetables. And many other things there be, which they have received to hold. The word they receive this from, as the washing of cups and pots, brazen vessels, and of tables. Now, the Greek translation does not say wash their hands oft. It says they wash their hands in a fist. In other words, we have a physical description of what the hand washing looked like, the ritual hand washing before in the time of Jesus. If you go to any place in Israel where a religious Jew will wash his hands for purification purposes or before a meal, till today, the element of using the fist exists. So which is quite amazing. So we have a description of the tradition, because rabbinical Judaism is in many ways a continuation of some of the Pharisee traditions or interpretations or understandings, the same way of washing your hands. But what is important to remember, the Pharisees washed their hands. Now, let's understand the difference between unclean and forbidden or impure. If an animal that you are allowed to eat dies, anyone who touches its carcass will be unclean. In other words, he will be impure. Anyone who eats some of the carcass must wash their clothes. If you eat something which is forbidden, it makes you impure. And the solution to that is washing yourself. You need to wash yourself. You need to wash your clothes. You need to purify yourself. You are impure. You have eaten something. You become impure by eating something that is impure, and very important. So the way you deal with it, if you've reached that stage, is you purify yourself in water. And in the Mishnah, the following ways to disqualify a truma, a gift to the temple: one who eats food with first degree of uncleanliness. In other words, you touch something that is impure, you are in the first level of impurity. You touch it, it becomes impure. One who eats food with a second degree of impurity. You touch something that was touched by something. One who drinks unclean liquid, same thing. Now remember, these are all eating unclean things. And unwashed hands, you did not wash your hands. That's exactly what Jesus was talking about. One who had immersion that same day. So you're not pure yet. You were impure, you had immersion, it takes you 24 hours. You will then be pure. And foods and vessels that have become defiled, they touched impure liquids. If someone eats or drinks impure food, his touch renders the priestly portion. So somebody who has eaten impure foods, that impure foods have gone into their system, they become impure. And one of the important things is unwashed hands. Uncleanliness, Rabbi Elazar says, he who eats food with first degree of uncleanliness, as we talked about before, once again, the Mishnaic discussion, the third level, the second level, and here we have an actual argument. Now let's go back to Mark 7, and maybe we can understand it a little bit better. And he said unto them, full will ye reject the commandment of God, that ye may keep your own tradition. Now, what is Jesus talking about? What is the own tradition versus Jesus' tradition? And this will take us back to the very important element that at the very beginning of Mark, Mark feels an emphasis, or Jesus feels an emphasis, to talk about the Pharisees and the scribes who came from Jerusalem. Because where was this all taking place? In the Galilee. Now, what we have to understand is the Jews of the Galilee stayed there. Most of the Jewish population of Galilee were there even when the Jews were taken into exile in 586. The Jews of Jerusalem, the vast majority of them, returned from Babylonia after 70 years and even more, 170, 270, and they developed traditions. Till today, the names of the Jewish months are names that were brought back from Babylonia. They developed traditions, interpretations, learnings that they brought back, which differed from Galilean Jews, which differed from Jesus and his disciples. So what Jesus is turning to them and saying, you have your traditions. Nowhere does it say I have to wash my hands. Now you are saying, if I don't wash my hands, I am becoming impure by putting impure food into me. I'm saying there's nowhere did God command us to wash our hands before eating. So I can eat with unwashed hands and I am still totally pure. Now let's take that and move ourselves a little bit forward. The tradition of the elders. Matthew quotes Jesus quoting Isaiah. Similar story that we talked about from Mark, but it'll help us understand a little bit better. But you say that if anyone declares that what might be used to help their father or mother is devoted to God, that they are not to honor. In other words, if you say, what I'm doing, I don't have to honor my father and mother because of my traditions, thus you nullify the word of God. You hypocrites, Isaiah was right. Once again, a misquotation of Isaiah. Jesus called the crowd to him and said, listen and understand. What goes into somebody's mouth does not defile him, does not make him impure. But what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles him. So Jesus is giving a different message than Mark's. What goes in does not defile. In other words, what you put into your body, if you do not wash your hands, that will not make you impure. But the words that come out of your mouth, when you say that you don't have to honor your parents, that will defile you. That will make you immoral. But again, the play on word exists here. Back to Mark as the tension builds. For it does not go into their heart, but into their stomach and out of their body. And then in saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. In other words, you don't have to wash them. You don't have to wash your hands. Jesus was literally physically talking about cleanliness or the tradition of washing of their hands. It goes into their stomach. What comes out of your heart can make you morally impure. What comes into your stomach and then out of the body, because in the Jewish world, things that come out of the body, menstrual blood, semen makes you impure. So Jesus is literally talking about how do you become impure? A woman during her cycle becomes impure. A man becomes impure literally, not what goes in by not washing your hands. So now we can reread the text and understand what Jesus was talking about, and then also understand the moral of his story. Then he called the crowd again and said to them, listen to me, all of you, and understand there is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile. In other words, make them impure. But the things that come out are what defile. Literally, Jesus was arguing with these Pharisees on the Jewish law with Jesus' amazing knowledge of Jewish law. It's what goes in does not washing your hands, not washing the food, that does not make you impure. That's why my students don't wash their hands, because that's how the whole thing started. If a man have ears to hear, let him hear. When he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. So what did you say and what is the moral of your parable? Now we can understand it. He said to them, then do you also fail to understand? What, you didn't get my message? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from the outside can't defile? It's not you can eat anything you want. Thus he declared all foods clean, since it enters not the heart but the stomach. And something wrong entering the heart will make you immoral, will make you morally impure. And it goes out into the sewer, literally. And he said, it is what cometh out of a person that defiles. You are morally impure, for your actions, what comes out of the human heart, will make you morally impure. So you have the law of, you have the law of the Bible. The foods not washing them are clean. Your immoral behavior that comes out of your heart will make you an immoral person. So what Jesus was trying to say, here you have these Pharisees who are so concerned about washing the hands and this and that, which is not even what God commanded. Jesus drew fences around to keep it. Jesus wouldn't change an iota, kutzo shel yud, the little piece in the yud. He would not permit all foods to be eaten. But you have to understand that if you're willing to be an immoral person and argue about the pureness of what goes into your stomach, you have totally and absolutely missed the message. And all these evil things come from within. They defile the person. Though we have to follow the law, Jesus is saying, but if you don't keep your moral standards, you are an impure person. Your heart is in the wrong place. So I hope you enjoyed today's talk. We got a good understanding about food in the Bible, what people actually ate. I hope you understood a bit about what the Bible says about what is kosher or unkosher, clean or unclean, permitted or not permitted as far as animals go. And you also got the message of Jesus arguing legal argument of the Jewish law, and I would even say more important, the moral argument. It's not what goes into your stomach physically, it's what comes out of your heart morally. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this lecture and would like to see more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Information on our biblical tours can be found on our website, christian-travel.com, and a link is in the description. That concludes today's lecture. Thank you again and stay safe.